All right, welcome everybody. We appreciate you joining us today. My name is Chris, and we'll be here with you for the next 45 minutes. We'll just do some brief introductions here and then give a little context of what we're going to cover today, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So yeah, today, as you can see, risk screening and coaching best practices is what we're going to cover. We're going to look at a few different things here. So we're going to talk a little bit, lay the foundation for why screening is important, and kind of use some statistics and things like that to really just look at like the impact that screening can really have on the young people that we work with. And then we're going to talk about things like workflows, how you can incorporate technology, just some best practices around screening, how you can get honest and consistent and reliable data out of that. And then we're going to finish off with some of the post screening, like risk coaching, right? And so a lot of that is going to be really found in motivational interviewing, and that's how we'll conclude the day. So we'll do a little bit of both of those pieces. And so as far as introductions, like I said, my name is Chris. I work for Possibilities for Change. My history in the field is primarily been spent in residential counseling or residential facilities, things of that nature. And where young people would come and stay with us. And so we did a lot of risk screening there, and we had obviously lots of follow-up and coaching. We would do anything from intake screenings. We would do things like life skills. We would do juvenile justice screenings. We would do everything under the sun, substance use, and found that we got a lot of really good actionable data out of that, especially when delivered via technology-based platforms. And then I was lucky enough to really get involved with motivational interviewing to really enhance some of my coaching practices when I, identified risks. So that's a bit about me. And now that I work at Possibilities for Change, we continue to train on motivational interviewing. So that's one of the things that we really kind of hang our hat on. And then we've, with the great Dr. Salerno here, she's developed a number of risk screening platforms that essentially, so technology-based platforms allow us to deliver that. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today, but without further ado, I'll let Dr. Salerno introduce herself as well.
Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here with you today. I am a nurse practitioner, licensed nurse practitioner, and a translational researcher. So what I try to do with all the work that happens at Possibilities for Change is really look at what the research is showing, take that information and translate that into easy to use practices, whether that's through screenings, technology, ways to use motivational interviewing. So we're excited to share some of the best practices that we've seen in the research and how we've translated that into some of the work that we do here.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I forgot to give a little bit of my background as well. I'm a licensed clinical social worker by trade. You'll see that we have Mackenzie here as well. Mackenzie's going to help us kind of with some stuff on like the back end. So if you are ending up having any technical issues or if you have specific questions about anything, you can certainly message Mackenzie directly. Mackenzie, anything else you'd like to say?
No, that's about it. Yeah, if you need any support or anything, just feel free to direct message me. Thank you.
Thank you. So we know many of us have been part of Zoom meetings. This one does take a little different shape. If you've ever been a part of a webinar, you notice that none of your cameras are on, and you don't have the ability to unmute yourself at the moment. Now we will be monitoring the chat function. There was already one question in the chat, was whether this will be recorded and sent out later, and the answer to that is yes, we are recording, and we will make sure we get this to you in case someone is not able to attend the live session. If you really have a question that you feel like is more in depth and you feel like would be better asked verbally instead of the chat, just say that in the chat. I do have the ability to allow you to unmute yourself. So if you feel like something that would like necessitate a dialogue, we can certainly do that. But just for ease, this is set up as a webinar. So we'll be monitoring the chat, but also if you feel like you need to have a conversation with us, please don't hesitate to reach out in the chat. We can let that happen. All right, Dr. Salerno.
Yeah, so I'm going to start out and just talk a little bit about risk screening. But before we do that, I wanted you to think about your practice in identifying and addressing risks in youth. So having that piece of understanding what those risks are and then how to respond to those. So what we're asking is, how effective do you feel that you are in identifying and addressing risks in youth? From 1 being, I don't feel like I'm very effective at all, to 10 being like extremely effective. Every youth that I see, I'm right on with identifying and addressing those risks. So you should see a poll in front of you right now if you want to kind of let us know where you are in that scale. And as we're waiting for a minute here, we won't go into all the different types of strategies in motivational interviewing, but this is one of them that can be highly effective in really understanding what it is that, how ready youth are to maybe step forward and make a change in something, how confident they feel they are, their intention to kind of move towards an action. It can be really effective to use a 1 to 10 scale, and there's lots of other ways that you can address the number that they choose. So just kind of putting an idea out there if you're interested in learning more in depth about MI than what we're going to go into today.
I see we've ended here, and it looks like we've got a pretty good mix. This is pretty common, right? Dr. Salerno, what we see here is just kind of that clump right there in the middle. You know what I mean? You've got some outliers that go a little higher, but it looks like that 6 range, 6, 7 range is probably our most selected number, and then some, you know, all the way up to 8, and then some down to 3 as well. So a nice mix of experience here for sure.
Great.
Wonderful. Yeah. And I just would echo what Dr. Salerno said here, just that it is something when working with you, this is a really powerful tool because it's a pretty easy way, like you said, to measure intention, readiness, confidence, all of those different pieces in making a change. And there's some follow-ups that you can ask that would really help to just kind of tease out what are some next steps, what are some strengths, things like that. So this is a really nice tool to be able to utilize with youth.
So really thinking about doing a quality risk screening and intervention, a lot of times people feel very overwhelmed with that because there's lots of different tools. There's all kinds of protocols then, depending on how a tool is responded to. Is there a score for the tool? How do I create that score? What does that actually mean? Some questions we hear, like, where do I even start with all of this? Sometimes your agency has tools that they want you to use, sometimes not. How do you know what risk screening tool will be most effective? So really thinking about your population, what are their greatest risks, if you know what those are, and what tools exist that might help you identify those youth that are at highest risk based on what you're screening for. And then once you do have those tools identified, how do you put that into practice? What are your workflows look like, especially if you're going to make some changes? Who's involved in that? Do you have support staff? Do you have professionals? Do you have like social workers or mental health staff to refer youth to if that's needed, depending on how screening tools are responded to or what the interpretations are? And then how can you use technology to help identify those risks, provide some of that intervention, and then understand your population at a greater level? So thinking about all of that, I'm sure a lot of us are like, oh, I don't even want to start, let alone know where to start. So we want to help you with a little bit of that today. So thinking about delivering quality services, what you want to do is identify needs in a comprehensive way. So what are the different risk areas that you're interested in learning more about in your youth? We all know there are so many behaviors, experiences, things that impact youth risk that we would be asking them 100 questions or more if we really were thinking about comprehensive risk. So what are the interrelated risks? If you think about that, typically it's substance use, mental health, and sexual health when you're thinking about teens. But there's lots of other risks in different populations that you may work with that may be at higher risk. So you want to really think about identifying the youth in greatest need within those risk areas and try to create workflows and utilize things like technology and other resources to decrease that burden, because all of us have limited time, lots of skill and experience and knowledge that we want to impart onto youth to help guide them towards being healthier, reducing their risk, but we also have limited time. So the more that we can reduce the burden on us as professionals, the more quality services that'll be able to be provided. We also want to work to overcome discomfort in addressing risks. We're not always comfortable with all of the different risk areas that we may be screening for, and figuring out how to improve that discomfort would be really important, kind of personal guidance that you may need, whether that's through education or talking with another colleague, some ideas like that. And then really ensuring that you have an evidence-based, effective approach that you're tailoring to the needs of your youth. And that can be some of the hardest pieces. So you've screened, now what do you do with that?
I just think underlining that overcoming discomfort is you want to, if you have a team huddle, things like that, kind of assess your personal risk. I feel like just anecdotally from the field, continue to see a greater variety of risks and things that continue to present themselves. So you kind of want to have a plan for that prior. If you're seeing these risks, whether it's a colleague who specializes in something like that, or it's just something like more professional development or something like that. But yeah, personal comfort and being able to identify which risks are maybe a weakness and some of your strengths, and then utilizing your team for that. I think that's a really important piece. So I like that notion there for sure.
So we just wanted to bring in some research that we came across within the last couple of months because it was pretty eye-opening, and I think things have changed a lot in the last few years. So what do you think to yourself, what percent of youth have died by suicide, visited a healthcare provider within the last year? What percent? And I don't believe we have a poll for this, right, Mackenzie? No. So just kind of think to yourself, what percent? You could even put it in chat if you want to be a little more interactive. So we have 85, 75. This is across the US, is what we're looking at, the research that we're pulling in here. So let's flip to the next one. It's 80%. So 80% of all youth who have died by suicide visited a healthcare provider within the previous year. And previous research that we've seen has said that 50% visited within the last month. So that may be like a complaint, a physical complaint. Maybe it was related to, anxiety or depression. It may not have been. So it's really important to think about your screening, what screening tools you're using, and what are your protocols for that? How often are youth being screened? Because we know that they're the least users of healthcare. So the fact that that high of a percentage of youth had seen a healthcare provider within the last year or in the last month is really telling that we could make an impact on this, and at least identifying and providing some of those initial resources and support. So thinking about workflows, that's usually the first piece in, okay, how do I incorporate this into practice? We're going to walk through a few of those. You may be working in multiple different settings. We work with healthcare providers, community-based organizations, schools doing school-wide screenings, individually working with youth, whether that's as a mental health, physical health provider, maybe a health educator. So there's lots of different ways that you may be interacting with youth, and a lot of ways that screening could be incorporated. So we think about that first level of screening. The next piece is, what do I do with that information? So having that discussion, you're reviewing the risks that were identified. You may be scoring a tool, or you may be using a technology that scores that tool for you. And then your next step in your mind is like, okay, what are my protocols? What are the results related to what do I do next? And are there resources and referrals available, whether that's in my agency or outside? And then you want to make sure that you have a way to look at the results of the screening of your population. It really helps in understanding what your population needs are and being able to look at that risk over time and the impacts that you've been able to make in reducing that. So thinking about that workflow, the first piece is creating that space of completing the screening. So is it going to be a paper and pencil screening? Is it technology? If it is technology, can you text or email a survey link, or do you have a device in your agency that they can complete that on? They should complete the risk screening form privately. So if you're in a healthcare setting, sometimes parents may be with them or not, or maybe peers. You want to make sure that you have a space set up that they're completing it themselves, that no one's looking over their shoulder or trying to help them complete it. We know as parents, a lot of parents want to help, especially in a healthcare setting or another setting where they're involved, their team complete the screening. So you want to make sure that they understand confidentiality and that they're completing it themselves.
I would, yeah, and just that piece about explaining confidentiality, we really recently did some work with like a youth advisory board that took a look at like how screenings are introduced, and that was one of the main things that they mentioned was confidentiality. They really place a very high level of importance on like, where is this going? Where is my data going? Who can see this? Can my parents have access to all of this? So I think that some of the ambivalence we have about if a youth is coming in maybe a little bit wary of taking a screening, that's a really important thing to do on the front end because they are very, very interested. I think, you know, it's a little different than when many of us were in school where everything wasn't so connected, social media, all this, right? They're a little bit more in tune with how information spreads. And so something like this that's discussing risk, I think is very, very important to them to know where it goes, who can see it, where it's being held. So the more that you can do on the front end to ease some of that anxiety around kind of where this is going to go, you'll see, I think you're going to get a little bit more consistent data. And that was really what I heard echo through from the youth advisory board about starting one of these things is just talking about safety and confidentiality and really kind of underlining that. So any work you can do on that is really important.
And even just having a script, if you have a support staff that's providing the screening to you, having a script that they could even just read or go through and make sure they hit key points would be really important.
For sure.
Another thing you may want to think about is just partitioning a separate area, whether that's in a waiting room or an area within your agency. If you're in a healthcare setting, maybe bring youth back to the exam room alone and have parents wait in the waiting room so that they can complete the screening before the provider comes in, or maybe completing the screening in a triage area. That seems to work the best for a healthcare setting. So sometimes they feel a little bit uncomfortable having parents like wait in the waiting room without them coming back first and then asking them to leave. So typically a youth and their parent is not going to a triage area to obtain like height, weight, blood pressure. They leave the parent in the waiting room and bring the youth to that triage area where they might have a device for them to complete the screening, or even paper and pencil at that point.
Great idea. All right.
So the CDC has a framework of criteria for screening and intervention. And it's really about a lot of the things we've talked about already, balancing how comprehensive a screening is with the burden on the patient and the provider, along with, you know, what is it that is high risk in our population, and what tools can we use to really understand the level of that risk, building upon those high priority questions, using, of course, person-centered and culturally appropriate workflows, processes, as much as possible, the tools themselves, have that shared decision-making, which is a part of motivational interviewing and really talking through those risks and next steps, having training provided to your staff, whether that's the front desk staff all the way to the, providers. Everyone could benefit from identifying a framework like motivational interviewing and being trained in that so that everyone's using similar strategies as you come in, even at that beginning process and explaining confidentiality all the way through talking through risks and next steps. Really having a protocol for offering that action-oriented information. So what can you do next to reduce risk using principles of quality improvement, of course, and incorporating information into your electronic health record so that you have a comprehensive picture of what's going on with that youth.
Yeah, all good things to consider for sure. I think that the more and more folks are focused on kind of providing this variety of things, especially, I really do like the comprehensiveness of the screening. We once again, kind of some of my experience with screening tools, looking back at some of the really, really long screenings, you just start to lose kids, right? You just, if it's 100 questions or something like that, eventually it's like a Scantron, they're just filling in C every time to just get through it. You know what I mean? So you want to balance how comprehensive it is with some of that burden that the patient, especially when we're working with adolescents, sometimes they just kind of lose that attention. So really being selective in what it is that you're selecting there, I think is really important. Anything else you want to mention here, Dr.
Nope.
Stein, before we move on? All
Good.
right. Cool. So now we've looked at some of the kind of the foundations, right? Why is it important? What are we going to, use the screenings for? How can we set up some of that physical space, which I think is very important. And I really do echo the notion of not doing it with the parents, because I've seen it, right? I've seen when you have a parent in the room and all of a sudden they're looking over junior's shoulder and they see, oh, you're sexually active, huh? And then all of a sudden it's an issue and then the screening has been derailed or something like that, right? So just giving them space to kind of be able to fill that out. But how do you know what tool is right for you? So one of the first things you want to look at is the screening tool validated and recommended, right? So a validated screening tool has been scientifically proven. We want to look for something that's valid and reliable. So something that's going to produce similar results if similar answers come in, right? That typically takes some sort of validation process. And then that's something that's typically going to be required to qualify for billing insurance reimbursement, right? So we know that when we're screening, we want to be able to provide services and bill for those services. But the use of a validated screening tool is oftentimes going to be required to achieve that, essentially. And then is it recommended by government or national healthcare organizations? There's lots of different places, SAMHSA, the AAP, National Health Institute, American Psychological Association, all of those different areas are going to give recommendations. And, they're going to use things, those are going to specifically look for things that are evidence-based, valid, and reliable, and just making sure they're recommended. You can see if they're widespread and things like that. So there's when choosing a screening tool, doing a bit of research just to ensure that you kind of meet those criteria is going to be a good way to get started. So once again, how long is the screening and what risks are being identified? So that notion of the length, I think, is very important because you want to reduce that burden, not only on yourselves. I know that many of you in a healthcare setting are going to have a very short window with young people. So do you want to ask something that's 40 to 60 questions or longer? Or do you want something that's a little bit more succinct and it's got some brevity to it, but it's really identifying the risks that you're looking to target, right? And so you're really looking for those risks that are most likely to impact youth health and well-being. So you know your populations better than anyone, and we do a lot of different projects that are focused on a lot of different things. Some areas have found really deficiencies in like social determinants of health, things like healthcare, access to education, food. Those areas are going to be a big priority, so we're going to make sure we screen for those things. Other places we want to look maybe more for like mental health, substance use, because those are the risks that are really bubbling to the top. And that was something that Dr. Salerno mentioned earlier, is just having access to that, like that data. So when you're starting to screen for things, and if you can look and see what risks are becoming the most pervasive throughout your population, and you can really start targeting for those risks. So really kind of just keeping an eye on it, or keeping your finger on the pulse of what it is that your population is experiencing, and making sure the screenings that you're utilizing are targeted for those type of risks. And then once again, when you prioritize these risks, you can reduce the length of the screening. So, maybe you're not seeing a ton of social determinants of health risk. Maybe your families are well connected, right? Maybe there's not a ton of food insecurity that you're noticing. So you may not have to screen as much for that, but you are noticing substance use is really pervasive throughout the community. So that may be an area that you strengthen that type of screening, and therefore you can kind of reduce some areas, strengthen others, and then really target those risks that you're seeing. And then how is the screening delivered? So multiple options, of course, like mentioned, there's a paper and pencil. That's the old fashioned way. And we know that that's certainly a way that can be done. You're going to get some good data from that. But what we found is that when you give a screening to a youth that way, so if you give them a piece of paper, they start to scan, right? I've had conversations with youth about what, kind of their preferences and how they like to take these things, but they let me know that when I see a piece of paper, I'm going to read 1 to 20 before I start answering, kind of see what's there. Sometimes they start making a plan, especially if they're ambivalent about it. They're like, ooh, I don't know if I want to answer this. Is mom or dad in the room? Maybe I don't want to answer that question this way, right? So we know that youth are less likely to be honest about their risky behaviors when they're using a face-to-face interview, right? Especially that can be a very intimidating thing. Coming into the medical system, coming into a behavioral health provider, anything like that, where you're doing a face-to-face, a lot of times that can be, there's power imbalances that are perceived from a young person, and they can really feel like I need to hide something or else I'm going to get in trouble with this person because they feel like that you may go tell mom or dad or things like that. And the same thing can happen on a paper-based survey. What we found is that giving it via technology-based screening has proven to increase engagement, honesty, and the validity of the risks identified. We just know how youth interact with technology. We know that not having that person there that's kind of looking over their shoulder or feeling the need to, like, I have to disclose something to you immediately, to your face, that does reduce some of the likelihood that they're going to be honest about it. And once again, this is not a one size fits all. You may run into a youth who's like, oh, I prefer paper screening immensely, right? And I do think that it's okay that if you run into that, to, of course, adjust to make sure that you're meeting the needs of that young person. But generally, what we found is that young people prefer to have their space, have that private setting, have a time to kind of process on their own, and then have an avenue to really follow up with an adult after that. So the more that you can provide that, and we just encourage you to try it out. If you've never used a technology-based screening platform to be able to utilize screening tools, try it out and see if it provides good results, and then see how it goes for you too. Does it reduce your burden? Does it help you to look at some of those top risks? Does it help you to just engage better with that young person because you're identifying it right there via something that's technology-based? Another thing that we like is technology removes variability. Many of us have come into work and had a bad day before, right? So how you look, we used to say this a lot, tone, volume, cadence. Sometimes the way that you deliver a question will impact how it's answered to you, especially if you're doing something that's face-to-face. Your body language, that's a huge piece of it. So if you're frustrated or if you're moving really quickly and you're just like trying to get to the next thing, youth are going to figure that out. They're going to sense that immediately and they're going to kind of sniff that out. So it's really important that if you are doing a face-to-face, you really kind of keep that under close observation, like how you're interacting and delivering it. That's one of the beautiful things about technology is that it removes that variability. So there's no worry about how it is that you look when you're asking, how you ask a question. So if you said something like use condoms, right? That's kind of a leading question, right? And so then they're going to be more likely to like, well, they want me to answer this way. So of course, yes, I use condoms every time. And then even though that might not be the case, and then you're going to see that you're not adequately addressing the risks around that sexual health or reproductive health there. And then how you talk about risky behaviors. And we're going to get to that a little bit here when we talk about follow-up and coaching with motivational interviewing. But if you were to say something like, just say no to sex, right? And you're practicing abstinence only, or kind of nudging the youth in the way that you would want them to respond, then you're going to be more likely to get less, quality information out of them. And sometimes that's going to foster some resistance because they're like, well, you're kind of lecturing to a degree, and that's kind of going against the spirit, if you will, of motivational interviewing. Dr. Solano, anything to add on any of that?
Oh, that's perfect.
All right. So also what the technology can afford you is that it can give you a personalized user experience. So as mentioned here, it's designed to engage with the youth. It is technology based, which we know how much our youth love technology. I'm guilty as well. I would prefer something like that as well to kind of old school, paper and pencil. But there's also things like audio and multilingual options. So if there's any literacy barriers or, if there's a different language that's a native language that's being spoken that would be a little bit more effective to deliver the screening in, that's certainly an option. It gives you the option to do remote screening. That's a benefit if you're maybe doing a larger screening, right? If you're doing maybe population-based or school-wide screening, that is certainly something that would be a benefit. The caveat to that is you want to make sure that the content is appropriate for that always. So something like food insecurity, there's a screening called the Hunger Vital Sign. That's something that just assesses for, food insecurity. That'd be a great one to give if you're looking to assess for a large population. If there's something that maybe talks about like suicidal ideation or, depression, I would be careful with that, of course, because if you give that on a remote basis and then all of a sudden you get information back that this young person is experiencing some suicidal ideation, then you certainly want to be careful, because if you don't have access to that youth, then that causes a number of issues, and chief among them the safety of the young person. But then you've also got to consider like liability and things like that. So just making sure that that screening is appropriate for when you're doing a remote screening.
And we've had some organizations doing that, and they just have very strong protocols. So it's not like it can't be done, but
Right.
definitely the cautions that Chris mentioned are important to think about.
Yeah, just something to make sure that you have something on the front end. If you're doing a school-wide screening and all the youth are there, and then you're, that's one thing. But the nature of some of this is that you can send a screening when at 5 p.m. when a youth is home, if you were queuing it up or something like that, you're going to see them the next day. So just want to make sure you have those strong protocols in place. That's a good point. And then brief interventions that are geared towards you. So the technology will allow for, as soon as risks are identified, there's brief interventions that are delivered immediately upon completion of a screening. So that will look a number of different ways, but essentially it's going to provide things that are also found in motivational interviewing, things like reflections, affirmations, menu of options, and then there's applicable links and resources that could explore some of those risks and how to intervene with those risks, essentially. And so you see there's a quote here. It says, "I've seen multiple students actually reading the information at the end of the survey, which is wonderful. It has truly guided many of my discussions with patients and prompted me to ask questions that I did not always ask in every clinical visit." And that was a provider of a mobile health unit. So additionally, the delivery via technology does allow for some trauma responsive pieces to be included and kind of infused within the screenings themselves. So the design of the screening is one of the ways. We know that we really took a look and we met with some experts that really kind of helped to talk about things like developmental trauma and just how you can kind of reduce the cognitive load by really giving that one question at a time, right? So as I mentioned, you give a young person who may struggle with sequencing or may struggle just being overwhelmed with a bevy of information, that's going to really increase that cognitive load. It could trigger, and then it could maybe make them feel unsafe at that moment and not get you as much honest data out of it. So really reducing that by really just asking one question at a time, it allows them to really focus on that piece there. You see at the bottom, you can unstack questions by really pulling them apart with like bolding, capitalization, and bullets. And then the use of like images and audio, once again, just really kind of leans into the way that we know youth interact with technology and how they can utilize that, or how we can utilize that to really leverage getting good information and then hopefully ultimately identifying and addressing risks within them. To continue with what I mentioned with that youth advisory board, the consent is such an important piece. This was one of the things that they really just, they hammered on, and how important this was that giving like a content warning essentially and describing what's going to happen. It can be a very scary thing as an adult, as a young person, does not matter. Walking into a medical setting and kind of not having an understanding of how this visit's going to go, that can be anxiety inducing. So describing the screening process through like a consent piece when screening, as well as talking about what content is going to be included, gives them a bit of an understanding of what's to come, gives them an opportunity to talk with a provider if maybe they don't feel comfortable on the front end, if there's maybe a little bit more that needs to be had in terms of conversation around like the confidentiality or how we create safety. That's a great way to do so by kind of putting that on the front end.
I think part of that too is a lot of times youth and adults, when you go to an organization, a community-based organization or a healthcare provider, you're not necessarily expecting to complete screening tools. It wasn't designated or part of your thinking in that visit or that service. So having that described and the content is a really important piece to be trauma responsive.
Absolutely. And so then just ensuring that they can skip questions if they don't feel unsafe or they don't really want to answer that is a good way to kind of foster some of that empathy and kind of create a bit more of that therapeutic alliance of, like, if you feel uncomfortable, then you don't have to answer this. So of course, we want you to answer it, we want to hear from you, but if you just don't feel comfortable, we're not going to force you to do anything that you don't want to do. And then at the end of the screening, of course, we're going to get that check-in on how they're feeling, kind of seeing if there was any response that occurred based on some of the content that was delivered. And then it's going to provide feedback and resources to them directly right there if they're interested, give them clickable links, and then also give them the ability to email themselves that to have that information at a later date in case those resources are of interest.
And we've created this design with any tool that's in the system. So if you think about using validated screening tools, some of the common mental health tools are the PHQ or the GAD. This framework was developed for every tool that's in the technology system that we developed.
Absolutely. All right, so now so in this workflow, right, we've talked about, of course, you're going to identify what are your top risks, what are the screenings you want to use. You've selected a screening tool. You've ensured that you've got, valid, reliable, promoted by large healthcare organizations and trusted agencies. So now what do you do once you get the information, which is probably one of the more important pieces, of course, right? So one of the main things you want to make sure is there standardized evidence-based information that's provided. So each youth should receive brief interventions tailored specifically to those risks that you've identified. What we know is that youth find things that are very specific to their instance or their, the issue, presenting issues or risks are going to be much more impactful than general information. So if you can give things that are very targeted, that's going to be more impactful. Key messages are going to be risk specific and provided in a prioritized manner to ensure that those most critical risks are discussed first. So like I mentioned, there's going to be, if you're identifying suicidal ideation compared to do you wear a helmet when you ride a bike, both of those things can be risky, but one of them, obviously, the ideation is going to be a lot more intensive, and that's what we want to target. So those are the ways we want to prioritize those things. And then our risk-specific community resources provided. So we want youth to be able to explore on their own. Sometimes they're just going to want to be able to look through things and kind of peruse at their own nature, but you want it to be community-based and kind of local and things of that nature. And you want it to be accessible after the youth leaves, ideally in electronic format. If you give a youth a piece of paper and say, call this number on this pamphlet, it's probably not going to get done, because how often are they going to misplace that? Or, oh, I left it on my desk, If they've got it digitally, if they've got it in an email, a text message, something along those lines, it's going to be a lot more likely they're going to have it and be able to access it at a later time. So anything before I transition, because now we're going to move for our last few minutes here into some of these motivational interviewing steps. And so overcoming challenges, of course, the first step is just going to ask. You're going to ask to ensure that you're including the right questions. So we kind of mentioned that in terms of what you're using in the risk count, in the risk screening itself. But then as we're doing the follow-up, and then we're going to listen and use effective communication strategies. So I'm going to go through just a few kind of like the really foundational motivational interviewing strategies that we really feel like are, especially in a short visit, are some good ones to include. So another example here is I've been seeing a patient for quite some time. When we implemented a comprehensive screening, the patient flagged for suicidal ideation. When I asked why she hadn't shared that question, she answered, no one had ever asked me. So once again, going all the way back to that beginning piece where 80% of young folks in the last year who completed suicide had seen a healthcare provider. We have to make sure we're asking those questions. It truly can be life and death. So why do we use motivational interviewing for youth? Well, number one, when we talk about adolescent development, we know that they have that desire for control, right? They're in that space where they want autonomy, they want to be able to have agency over their situations, they want to have input when it comes to it. And motivational interviewing is going to allow for us to do that. And it allows the youth to drive the process. So they're going to put them in the driver's seat and allow them to be the expert of their situation as much as we possibly can. And that's going to lead to less resistance and us to be more effective when we're counseling and providing coaching. So where do I start, right? If you think about motivational interviewing, where do you start? The spirit of motivational interviewing is really exploring ambivalence, right, to change. So you can start with that spirit of really empathy. That's where we want to come from. Change is hard. Acknowledge that on the front end. It's always okay to just say, any change that you see in counseling that you're providing, this is a difficult topic. I know it can be very difficult to meet with me. It's the first time you've ever met me. This is uncomfortable for you. Just acknowledging that on the front end can automatically lower some of those defenses and really start to help them kind of open up a bit more. And just, I want to be a resource to you rather than, probe or anything like that. So what is important to you? And then kind of walking through that. Asking permission is a great way to get started. So maybe you've identified some substance use issues. If you just start out by saying something similar like, hey, is it okay if, I've noticed some things that you flagged for on your screening. Is it okay if we have a conversation about that? It's a very easy way to start by, just getting their input. Once again, building rapport. Some folks ask what happens if they say no, then that's okay. If it's not something that's, if it's suicidal ideation, that may not be a time we're going to ask about permission because we know we need to talk about that. But if it is something that you feel like, you have the ability to maybe you could talk about it at a later time, or you can just flip it on them if they say no and say, okay, well, you tell me what you know about it already. What do you know about, young people using marijuana or young people having unprotected sex? Once again, putting them in the driver's seat, allowing them to be the expert. And then it's a good way to kind of break down some of that resistance. Otherwise, we have a couple strategies. If you've ever been through motivational interviewing, you've heard of the OARs. So the open-ended questions, affirmations, or reflections. And I'm going to go through each one of those here briefly in our last few minutes. So I just mentioned that. So your open-ended questions, this is really going to be your backbone of information gathering. So if you want to gather more information about what it is that a young person may have flagged for on a screening, this is a great way to do so. An open-ended question is essentially going to be anything that cannot be easily answered with a yes or a no. So if you find yourself getting stuck in those just constant repeated closed-ended questions where you're getting yes or no's, then try to use some of these more fully open-ended questions that you see here on the left side of the screen. We call these starters, and there's a good way to take something that's closed-ended and turn it into a more open-ended question. And then, so something like, what do you think about? What do you think about trying to use protection? Tell me about when you decide to drink on the weekends. How do you decide when to wear your seatbelt in the car? Help me understand why you decided to skip class, right? Those are some good ways for you to be able to just create a more fully open-ended question. And then what you're doing from there is listening for change talk. So change talk is going to be anything that indicates a youth would like to make a change. So once you've heard that, all of a sudden they say, well, I know that I shouldn't be drinking as much on the weekend. That's change talk, because they said I shouldn't be drinking as much on the weekend. Then you can move into one of these key questions. So given what you told me, what do you think you'd do next? Where would you like to go here? You know, what if you tried to cut down on your drinking on the weekend? What would it take for you to only you know, have one beer instead of 6 this weekend? Whatever that looks like, just starting to explore some of that. So that's a really good way to start exploring with some of these open-ended questions.
And as you're learning and trying to utilize some of these, you can even like print them out, like type them out, write them out, just have them as a little like sticky on your computer or on the desktop, just to help you think through, you know, how can I get past some of this resistance or have more conversation around all of these different risks that you might be talking about.
Absolutely. So affirmations are really, so a lot of people, when they think of affirmations, they almost think of compliments. Affirmations in motivational interviewing are going to be a little bit different. It's really specifically targeted at a effort to make a change or a success in making a change. Not every time, it does not have to be a successful change is made, because that can take time. Now, if you see a young person putting forth effort, then it's a great time to give an affirmation. Those are going to foster self-esteem and self-worth. Youth are going to live up or down to our expectations. So if you can continue to help push them in the right direction and empower them, either them and their families, it's a great way to continue to get them feeling like they can make a change. So you want it to be very genuine and very specific and targeted at a specific behavior. And that's a great way for you to be able to just continue to support that young person. So if we looked at connecting these two, right, what that could look like, you start with an open-ended question. What kind of activities are you interested in doing? Or where do you want to start, right? And then maybe they say, you know, I'd like to start incorporating a walk every day because I'd like to lose some weight. I want to get in shape for next basketball season or something like that. And then you could use an affirmation to support that. You have thought through the activities that would work for you, or you are committed to incorporating a walk after dinner into your daily routine. So it's a great way you can kind of connect some of these strategies and utilize those when working with youth. All right, and the last thing we're going to take a quick look at is just reflective listening. This is really, I'm almost not doing it justice because of the time we have left, because this is one of the tougher skills to learn, but I just want to kind of give a quick, you know, overview of reflections, because really this is going to be, once you get good at reflections, once again, they're tough to master, but once you get really good at reflections, then you will find that the amount of questions you have to ask, number one, reduces, and then you'll really be able to keep a conversation going with a young person by just providing some of these reflections. It does require active listening, because you're going to be listening for certain things and making some assumptions about some things they've said. Sometimes it's going to be stating back what you heard rather than asking questions. And it's not always just a repeat. A lot of times you want to continue that paragraph. So you're going to add emphasis to certain things, additional meaning, or continuation of a thought. And so what it might look like if a young person came to you and said, I've tried using condoms, it just never works out. Sometimes we get caught up in lecturing, and if you need a second to just gather yourself, sometimes you can just use a simple repeat. And so what that may look like is just repeating an element of what the youth has said. And so something like, you have used condom in the past, right? And then they're going to say, yeah, I've used condoms in the past. It's just never really worked out for me. It's really difficult to make it consistent. You know, my partner, you know, struggles when we try to use it, whatever. You're going to get a lot of good information from that. So it's a great way to just kind of do a simple repeat, but also give yourself a moment to just kind of rethink. Now, a rephrase is staying close to what the youth has said with some rephrasing and synonyms. So once again, you could say you're having sex and not always using protection. And then once again, they're going to go into those reasons why they maybe they're not using protection, some of the barriers, and then you can lead that conversation down that path and see how you can overcome some of those barriers. And over 1 minute, this is our last slide here. And then we can look at paraphrasing. So paraphrase is going to be inferring or guessing at the meaning of what the youth has said and reflecting it back. So you're guessing a little bit here. They said they've been using condoms. You could just simply reflect with, you would like to be safer when having sex. And then they talk about, yeah, of course, I'm scared of STIs and I don't want to do that. I'm not a space right now where I want to get my significant other pregnant. You know, I have some things I want to do in the next few years of my life that this would not be a good time. And then that's all change talk that you're going to be hearing, and then you can kind of lead them down that way. Once again, we're trying to push them towards that change talk to ultimately kind of conquer some of that ambivalence to a change. And then lastly, reflecting feeling. This can be really powerful, especially if you're working with younger clients, because if you reflect content with younger clients, sometimes we're not going to process it as well. But feelings are something they may be a little bit more in tune with. So something like emphasizing the emotional dimension through feeling statements and metaphors, it's scary to think about getting an STI. It's an assumption that they're scared of it, but it's a pretty good assumption. And so to utilize that, they're going to focus on, yeah, here are all the reasons why it's scary. And then from there, once again, you're going to listen for that change talk and kind of help coach them through that. So
Yeah, reflections can be just the tool in your tool belt that really makes a difference in what you hear from youth. Because as a provider, if you hear, I've never tried using condom, or I've tried using it, just never works out, we automatically want to tell them why they should be doing it or ways that it could work out versus reflecting first so that they start telling you what's gotten in the way and we're not just spewing information. They're really part of the conversation, and it makes an enormous difference in what they're going to do when they walk out.
absolutely. So that was a really quick overview of some skills there in motivational interviewing, and just wanted to kind of tie in how you could utilize some of these with your coaching. So we appreciate it. Thank you for being here with us. I'm putting my email up here too. That was really quickly. So if you do have questions about any of like, especially the motivational interviewing skills or anything that we covered, I do encourage you to reach out. I'm happy to set a time to meet with you just to discuss. We do offer full trainings of that as well. So if there's anybody who's like really craving more motivational interviewing, of course, we offer that as well. So but we thank you so much. And if there's any questions, we're happy to answer any of those. But yeah, we appreciate your time today and thank you all.
And Mackenzie has shared some information sheets that give you a little more details of some of the ways that we can support risk screening and using motivational interviewing in your coaching.
And if you are watching the recording of this and you were not able to access that, please reach out if you are interested in any of that information. But thank you all. Have a wonderful day, and we appreciate you being here.